Hello, everyone, and welcome into CrushTheStreet.com. I got Charles Ortel on the line with me today. And if you're wondering about what's going on with the economy, with geopolitics, with the truth of what is going on right now, unfiltered from mainstream agenda, Charles is an authority in the investment space. His website is charlesortel.com. Charles, thanks for coming on the show with me here at Crush the Street.
It is my great honor. Thanks for having me on.
Charles, let's start off here. We're looking at the numbers, especially if you look at CNBC or the mainstream. Trump is getting the economy fired up. Stocks are doing well, earnings are up, and by a lot of metrics here, wages, people are feeling inspired, and on paper, things seem good, but you also have this dynamic going on right now where the yield curve is flattening, which is usually indicative of some sort of recession. So I'd love to get your thoughts here on what's going on with the economy and your assessment at the moment.
Sure. Well, I think to see the present situation in context, it's important to go back quite a long period of years. We go all the way back to 1965, but let's pick it up in 82, which was the beginning, 1982, which was the beginning of the longest uninterrupted serious economic boom in America's history, from 82 to around 1998, 1999. That was a very important period because in that long period, interest rates were actually very high. Though they declined, they remain on average on the 10-year well higher than current levels. And well higher than any subsequent long average period. And what happened was a large number of baby boomers finished with school, entered the workforce, just in a nutshell, as the global economy became a reality. And so you were able in this great country to put a lot of people to work, to have a lot of families form, to have those families go buy houses and fix them up and have children and spend money. And at the same time, in that period, in the early period, 82 to 88, China was still locked down in a backward-thinking approach, a communist approach where they were redistributing nothing. And India had not made a commitment at that point to being in the capitalist world. So against weakened competition, Europe had been destroyed twice in two world wars. Europe at that time was still in the beginning more socialist and thinking about private enterprise. So in that period, America rocked and rolled, and we inflated a gigantic bubble. The regulators did not do their job. We've succumbed to mania in the internet bubble, and then things burst. And rather than try to address the core structural issues that have happened by 1998, 99, those including that our governments, our various government sectors have by that time already gotten too big, that our regulations and tax system and approach towards risk-taking did not favor entrepreneurs, did not favor creating private sector labor. Rather than address those issues, what the regulators did, in part, is they kept interest rates even lower, and that masked some of the problem. So then we had, of course, we had the dread events in September 11th, 2001, we then accepted this national security state, deep state in the United States. And if you look at the period, say, 98 to maybe 2007, the growth trajectory in incomes for workers, in aggregate income in total for private wages and proprietors' income, the growth rate in that just is nowhere near what it had been 82 to 98, 99. Then the unimaginable happened, and we nearly went under in 1990. The global system nearly did crash by October of 2008. Again, rather than saying, maybe the problem here around the world is there's too much ineffective and expensive government, and maybe we ought to tear the bureaucracies apart and keep money in the hands of the people who know how to spend it best while having a real effective safety cushion for the poor, not for the bureaucracy helping the poor. Rather than do any of that, central banks decided to really go for broke, triple down, and put interest rates way, way down. So the 10-year fell below 2%. Overnight rates for moments of time were 0 to a quarter or less annualized. And in that environment, we instead of really thinking about building a better product or service in the main, what we started to do was, operate a casino society where everybody's trading, everybody's deal making, and not enough people are truly selling products and services, really worthwhile products and services for cash to customers. You think about some of the great growth stories, success stories. You think about, for example, Facebook and Google and Twitter. These are enterprises that I would call derivative businesses. They don't actually sell anything to the customer. They sell access to potential customers via advertising. And, these are businesses that it's a crazy business model. But in this casino environment where interest rates are down, where there aren't that many good publicly traded investment opportunities, people have been for too long trading in a casino, not understanding that there's a lot more to life than day trading or machine trading. And so what's happened under Trump, he inherited I would argue, a horrible hand, but in a short period of time, scant months, he has reversed Obama's disastrous war on capitalism. He has, not simply by changing the tax code in an historic way, but by paring back regulations. The entrepreneurs saw this on or before election night when it became apparent he was going to win. The markets were bid up, expecting just what's happened, that Donald Trump is making it easier for real business people, and I'm not casting aspersions on traders, but for people who are actually building a better mousetrap, selling a better service, for those people to get behind creating real businesses that sell their goods and services for cash, doing so from an American base. And, that's America's open for business under the Trump administration, and so long as conservatives in both parties, that is, economic conservatives, remain having influence in our Congress. And that contrasts with the balance of the world. If you look at Europe, the European Union, I've long been against a union that is nothing more but a super bureaucracy, and I use the word super as a negative adjective. It's just another bureaucracy piled on top of the bureaucratic national state governments in all the European states. That experiment, I think, is a disaster. It's piled up a lot more debt. It hasn't really created a unified market, and people in country after country are peeling out of the EU. After you get past the EU, even if you look at some of the big economies, Europe and Japan, they're not that big. The consumption by households of goods and services in those economies is really not that big. And then when you strip out the top 10% from any country and compare it to the bottom 90% in America, our market is deep and wide. Now under Trump, we're open for business. And yes, there are signs in the interest rate market, the credit markets, in both the level of interest rates and in the yield spreads, that there's danger lurking on the horizon. You think about, in Europe, for example, their experiments since January 1st, 2009, many of those countries still have negative interest rates. Yeah. Crazy. Wow. And then, Japan has not been able to get its act together since 1989. The Chinese and Indian experiments, I would argue, are massive bubbles. Brazil is almost a failed state. South Africa will become a failed state to address the so-called BRICS. So the action is here inside the United States of America, and what I think will happen is a lot similar to what happened in virtually every major crash. Capital will look around the world and say, I'd rather take, if the 10-year's 2.8% now, I'd rather take 2.25 in the U.S. than pay for the privilege of letting you have my money in German bunds or something like that.
Charles, let me jump in there. It's one of those things where you alluded to this. The U.S. has a problem, and Donald Trump inherited a massive problem to deal with. And alone, you look at this and go, hey, this is unsustainable. This is a problem, and we should have hyperinflation. There should be problems left and right. But the reason we don't have this is by comparison, and again, you alluded to this, is a lot of the other countries are right there with us or even worse. So by comparison, there's still some demand here for the U.S., and that artificially sustains the status quo. So, I mean, can you try to, if you can, help us wrap our minds around what we're facing here, and how long the U.S. can continue to go on with business as usual, artificial stimulus, essentially if the whole world is doing the same thing, and by comparison, really no other competitor to attract dollars away from the U.S.
Okay, so if we look at the U.S. And we compare ourselves, there's a great body of data in UNCTAD, their database that takes apart, does many different things, but the database that takes apart gross domestic product by key component from 1970 to 2015 by year in dollars for every country in the world gives you a sense of just how special our economy is. The share that consumption plays of the total economy is very high in the United States compared to certain key countries around the world, notably China, but also Germany and elsewhere. So our market is very, very large, and it is a unified market. And Donald Trump has made America open for business already. And what we have been doing, I think, particularly in America, is our entrepreneurs have been disrupting the gigantic bureaucracies. Think about GE, General Motors, and others. Has been disrupting the traditional way in which goods, products, and services have been delivered to the American consumer and indeed to other consumers. But the one place that has not been disrupted yet in this country is government. And what has evolved, in my opinion, is, yes, there are many fantastic people in government, but there has evolved a system where instead of really addressing true need at the bottom of the totem pole, we have created these gigantic bureaucracies where there are too many government workers making way too much money when you consider both their salary and their pensions, which private sector workers don't get anymore, to say that they're addressing problems that never seem to get solved. That's something that has to get fixed, and I think Donald Trump is doing his level best to do that. And it's going to take, this situation has been built up arguably since 1945. It's not going to be very simple to turn around and get it unstuck, but Donald Trump is doing his best to do that, and the people around him are doing their best to do that. And most importantly, people, if you've got spare capital to invest and you look around the world and you say you want to put it in a business, a platform to do business globally, the U.S. suddenly looks extremely attractive. The tax wrinkles for multinational businesses are very interesting, particularly if they're exporting. And so, I think compared to the rest of the world, Donald Trump and Congress so far is making America dramatically more attractive than most other countries in the world to get involved in business, and also to think that your personal safety will be taken care of. I mean, as bad as the horror stories are in Chicago and New York and elsewhere, this country is very safe compared to Brazil, for example, compared to India, compared to even perhaps to China. It's a country where you can put your money in as a foreigner and get it out if you want to get it out.
Sure.
As for inflation and hyperinflation, I think we have to be very careful about that, because when I look, I'm not an economist, but when I look into the underlying data on it, the weights that the so-called experts place on the components of what determines urban and rural inflation in this country, I don't think they make any sense. And I think what we do have is we have a system where the friction, the costs that you see every day, to live, to pay for gas, those kind of costs, those seem to be rising, with the exception of telecommunications costs. But I see in this overbuilt city here in New York, Manhattan, I see and have seen for months now real estate prices dropping, and that's like 40% of the index all in. So to think about inflation, it's not. I don't think it's as simple as using the traditional tool. I also think that there's a lot of spare capacity around the world, and in particular in the United States of America. The St. Louis Fed has a capacity utilization table that does capacity utilization for manufacturing and I think services the same way it has been done for many, many decades. And I don't think that's fair. I think you can do a lot more today with, the capacity utilization, we're probably operating at a very low fraction of our true capacity inside this country. And then you think about capacity across Europe and Japan, places where there is a lot of investment in infrastructure and know-how and history. I think I'm not somebody who believes there's going to be, skyrocketing inflation at this moment in time.
Sure. Well, and I would like to ask you then about your thoughts on gold. Again, looking at these numbers and just to piggyback off of, the last question, many people are scratching their heads, with all this money printing, artificially low interest rates, why aren't we seeing a reflection of hard assets go up? And we're seeing that obviously in stocks. We've seen that to a degree for the last few years since the '08 crisis. Things like real estate get more and more expensive. And I know you pointed out that, we're starting to see a reversal in that. But what about gold? We haven't really seen anything largely significant reflected in the gold price here, and we're significantly under 1,300 now.
Yeah, so I'm a long-term gold bug. Everybody has, things about their background that make them like certain things and dislike certain things. In 1848 and in 1864, ancestors of mine got involved in gold mining, and one of them got very lucky. And so I'm, somebody who believes that it makes sense to have a fraction, small fraction perhaps, of one's portfolio in physical gold. And you can have quite a lot of physical gold, even if you live in a 400 square foot studio apartment. You can easily put $1 million worth of gold into a small space like that. And most people don't have $1 million in gold. So, as I think about the precious metals, I always try to compare with gold, platinum, and palladium. And I note for the car, anxiety about the whole automotive sphere, and catalytic converters and all that, the platinum and palladium both seem to be even more depressed than gold. But gold is a place to put a portion of one's assets. And with the price down here at 1,200, I think you always have to. My people have taught me well. When prices drop for something you think holds fundamental value, time to add to your position. Right.
Well, Charles, I'd love to touch on this next topic here with you, and especially as it pertains to the economy. The next major socialist move here, the degradation of continuously seeing government get bigger, despite a good guy such as Donald Trump doing what he can. Over time, I only expect the government to grow and to degenerate, what we have or what we've started with since inception. Now, the next big socialist climax that I'm expecting is universal basic income. We're starting to see a lot more talk about this. And what better way to spoon feed this new big government plan than to scare people with AI and job displacement and robots taking their jobs. Therefore, the government needs to take care of everyone through some sort of basic income. And I'll just kind of leave it at that and give you an opportunity to just share your thoughts on AI, universal basic income, and just kind of the changing dynamics of the economy going forward here.
Sure. Well, so that's a great question. And when you go back, I'm an amateur student of history, and who started out in college studying developing country economics. And when you go back through the long sweep of history, there has always been a surplus of labor, of potential labor. Right now, there are countless people locked down in countries around the world who, some might be very happy to still live the way they're living, but many others flock to the urban centers, can't find work. That's before you start thinking about just inside the United States of America. So there's always been a surplus of labor. What government has done, in my view, and I think it animates people on the right and the left and across the spectrum, government has pushed up the cost of hiring people in this country and made it prohibitively difficult, for the entrepreneur to go and make that decision and say, let's take a flyer on this person. Let's pay him $35,000 this year, see how it might work. Because when you go down that track, next thing you know, it's what if there's this lawsuit or that lawsuit or this extra cost or this form to fill out or whatever. And government in this country needs to be pro hiring in the private sector. And this idea that to pick on one person who I like to pick on, that Rod Rosenstein could claim in defense of this, he's the Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, could claim, well, he doesn't really know what's going on with each of his senior employees because, after all, he's in charge of 110,000 people. I mean, that's the problem in a nutshell. We don't. There are not many American businesses that have 110,000 workers, let alone a department of the federal government. And we really need to go through a period here of changing the equation. Instead of saying, we need some fanciful Obamacare scheme that's going to cost, however many trillions it costs and not work by pushing up the price of health care, instead of going that approach, we got to figure out how to use what you're talking about, use AI, use other technological tools to reduce the cost of delivering truly valuable services to all Americans, but in particular to people at the bottom of the food chain. And, I'm sure we can get a whole bunch of papers from PhDs and other academics at these subsidized elite universities with massive endowments that are overcharging their students, overpaying their professors, turning out in the main a bunch of hogwash embracing unregulated globalism. I have no doubt we can find all kinds of people, distinguished professor here and there, to defend that. But the truth is, that's not what we need. We need to take education as an example. Why is the cost of education at these elite universities, why has it risen so much faster than a benchmark CPIU for inflation? Why has that happened? It makes no sense. There should be a lot more places at these endowed universities whose endowments have jumped up. Professors should be forced to focus on teaching and not private equity investing and being venture capitalists and giving speeches. They need to be educating. And if they're going to take a subsidy for, a U.S. Federal tax and state deductions, benefits rather, for donors who donate to these endowments and these universities, if they're going to be subsidized by the American taxpayer, then they shouldn't be engaged in fomenting schemes that will ultimately harm, the national concept of America. So I think we're getting a lot of muddy thinking and have been getting muddy thinking out of university land for too long. I'm against the idea of basic income without really thinking. It hasn't worked in certain countries that have tried it, and it can create just an entitlement culture, a laziness culture, that it would be fine if we were sitting here with no debt to begin with, but at $22 trillion of federal debt and all these contingent liabilities that are tough to price, probably get our real debt up above $100 trillion or more. This isn't a time to be suggesting to voters that, for the rest of your life, you just do what you want. You don't have to, we'll just pay you to do nothing. I think that's irresponsible.
Yep, I agree with you. And, we have all these examples, right, of Social Security lagging purchasing power. I think I read some statistic that was showing that we're down in purchasing power with Social Security by 30% since just 2000. And, you see that with the way teachers are protesting in the streets, saying that we're not making enough money and they need to make more money to keep up with the cost of living. And again, that's depending on the government, the redistributing of tax dollars, which is inefficient. Anytime you do that sort of setup, it's going to lag the free market. It's not going to reward the people who are thriving the most, and it's going to artificially sustain lack of production, lack of quality. So I agree with you wholeheartedly on that, Charles. Charles, if you would, please share some closing thoughts here as we close out this interview, and what you are just suggesting to people in general, not specific financial advice, but just advice in general on how to approach, here we are in July of 2018, how are you suggesting people to advance this second half of 2018?
Great question. So I think this is a moment to believe that it's going to make sense inside America to either start a business or nurture a business and get far more active and aggressive in trying to sell that better mousetrap, sell that better service to our fellow citizens in your local community, across your state, across this country, and around the world as you get bigger. That's a very productive place to spend a lot of time and energy. There are a lot of existing businesses that have, they're wedded to old ideas that are not doing it, they're not thriving. They're hamstrung by, their own footprints. And so I think in this environment, this is a chance for people to be forward-thinking and to really engage in the meat and potatoes, old-style bricks and mortar, and maybe technology-assisted kind of business. That's where I would be focusing my time, not in speculating. There are too many big central banks that have been, way more money, way more wherewithal with the government backing they have to, game things, to artificially prop up prices that shouldn't be as high as they are, or to stop a short opportunity from actually coming to fruition and creating a short squeeze. It's very dangerous in my mind to be thinking about speculating, particularly with debt, which too many people are doing too much of. So I'd be getting back to bricks and mortar stuff. I would be thinking very cautiously. If I had debt, I would be getting a plan together to get out of debt as quickly as possible. And if you can't get out there and get involved in starting a business yourself, to get a professional credential of some kind or another, not necessarily a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, but get a credential where you can market the skills that you have with that scarce credential, and roll up your sleeves and stick to it. And I think here in this country, for our many faults, we're far better off than so many other countries in the world. And I think even in adversity, most Americans will not do as poorly as others around the world do, and even can do well.
Powerful words there. Charles Ortel, everybody. Charles, if people want to learn more about your work and the work that you put out, please share your website and what they can expect to find.
Sure. The best way to, I try to be an active tweeter, so I'm at Charles Ortel, O-R-T-E-L, on Twitter, and I generally try to react or even get out ahead of the news. My website is my name. You can find quite a few interviews by just Googling me. And then, in addition, there's a wonderful human being named Jason Goodman, who is an NYU Film School graduate, Hollywood veteran, and we've put out 85 two-hour, on average, videos concentrating on some of these issues, but more specifically on charity fraud as it relates to the Clinton Foundation. Those can be found on YouTube, Periscope, Facebook, and elsewhere. But the name of the organization Jason runs is called crowdsourcethetruth.org, and there's quite a bit of material out there. So those might be some few places to look.
Perfect. Well, Charles, thanks for coming on Crush the Street. I appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom with us today. It's greatly appreciated.
My great pleasure. Have a wonderful summer.